Hello and welcome to the Investigative Journal. I'm Tal Heinrich coming to you from Times Square in New York City. Venezuela in 2019 has entered a tailspin. Its people are starving. Its neighbors are becoming fed up with the actions of the dictator, leading by a threat from Caracas. And civilians, they are stuck in the middle between starvation and suffering on one hand and the fight for freedom on the other. In today's episode, we will explore what it means to not just fight or flee from your own country, but what is the aftermath and the side effects of years of socialism and civil struggle in Venezuela, and how all of this affects the most vulnerable and innocent, children. More than 1 million Venezuelan refugees have crossed the border to neighboring Colombia in the past few years alone. Colombia has integrated many refugees into schools and the labor force, but integration and resettlement policies also face security and economic challenges. To discuss all of this, we're joined by our first guest for today from our Washington, D.C. studios, Colombia's ambassador to the United States, Mr. Francisco Santos Calderón. Ambassador, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. And I've been to the border like 8 times this year, bringing senators and congressmen. So I know what you're talking about. I know the challenges. I know how the situation is deteriorating, but also the efforts that Colombia has been pushing forward. I visited a school that has 1,400 desks or slots for children. 1,200 of them are for Venezuelan children, 200 for Colombian. And the really difficult issue is that most of the children that come in are absolutely discolorized because they go to school, but the teachers in the other side of the border in Venezuela don't go to class. They're not being paid, don't teach. So the Colombian teachers have to bring them up to speed, which is also a very difficult task to do in such difficult circumstances.
Recently, Colombian President Iván Duque announced that 24,000 children born to Venezuelan refugees in Colombia will be given the right to citizenship. Tell us, what other initiatives has the Colombian government adopted in order to help refugees, especially women and children, coming from Venezuela to your country?
The first and most important policy is opening the doors, is having absolute solidarity with our brothers. We're of same descent. We used to be a same nation. We have more than 2,000 kilometers, so opening up the doors. More than 700,000 permits to work and stay temporal. I think that's going to be increased. But letting them come in, it's the most important thing because many are going all over Colombia and are integrating into Colombian society. You have 300,000 in Bogotá. You have around 150,000 in Medellin. You have 1.8, I would say even more, million Venezuelans right now going into all of Colombia. You don't see the smallest town in Colombia without a Venezuelan. So they are integrating, and therefore the brunt of this massive migration, which is the #1 in the world, is not. It has been dispersed, so it's not. It's easier to manage. But up till now, the resources are certainly not enough. Our cities are having big budget problems to sustain this level of migration, to integrate kids in schools, to give them all of them health. So it's a very challenging situation. But I would say the most important policy is opening up the doors, understanding that you have Venezuelans starving, Venezuelans dying of not having food, and therefore you need to open the doors to help them at least get a better life.
On a less pleasant note, Ambassador, a delegation of researchers from Human Rights Watch America's division, they recently visited the Catatumbo territory on the Colombian side of the border with Venezuela, and over 25,000 Venezuelans have found themselves living in this former FARC stronghold, having fled the civil war in their home country. The situation there appears to be dire. The Human Rights Watch report documented killings, disappearances, sexual violence, recruitment of children as soldiers, and forced displacement. What is the Colombian government doing in order to assist Venezuelan refugees who are stuck there between their country's dictatorial policies on one side and the Colombian insurgent groups on the other?
Let me give you a little bit of context. The Catatumbo area is just on the other side of the Colombian border. You have 30,000 hectares of coca. That area is controlled by the ELN, a terrorist organization from Colombia that is absolutely based in Venezuela, that is being used by the Venezuelan dictatorship as a paramilitary force. It's controlled also by former FARC members, dissidents that control the areas. They're also on the other side of the Venezuelan border, and by a paramilitary group called Los Pelusos. It's more than anything else a drug trafficking group. So that conflict generates huge levels of violence, conflict for territorial control, and a very difficult situation for the Colombian state. When you look at that area, it's very mountainous. It's with very difficult access. And with all the support that those groups are getting from Venezuela, because the Venezuelan dictatorship understands that drug becomes a necessary element for financing its survival. Therefore, it's allowing them to work, to move, to transport, to transform drugs in Venezuela is creating a huge problem. They're recruiting Venezuelans. They ask for less money than the Colombians, therefore the drug business becomes more profitable. They're recruiting children of Venezuela who are migrating, again, to charge even less money. So it's a dire situation, as you say. What we are going to do in Colombia, we're designing 3 special intervention zones and areas where the whole state is going to come in with security, with infrastructure, with eradication, forced and also crop substitution. And one of those areas is Catatumbo. This is not going to be done in a year. This is not going to be done in a day. This is going to take time, but the government has a policy of intervening 3 areas. The south, Tumaco, the northwest, El Bajo Cauca Antioqueño, and this area of Catatumbo near the Venezuelan border.
Now, according to the same Human Rights Watch report, you mentioned the militias. Dozens of Venezuelan children have been recruited by these armed groups,
yes,
like the ELN, the EPL, to fight against Colombia's armed forces. What does the government do about that? Can the government somehow prevent their enlistment?
It's very difficult. Look, when you have a massive migration like we have, it's very difficult to control those types of movement by the illegal organizations. They pay them. They pay them from the same money they get from drugs. Therefore, in that situation, what you get and what you have is the ripe environment for recruitment. And when you have a government that is sustaining those illegal terrorist organizations like the dissidents of the FARC, like the former EPL drug gang, and by the ELN, and they're using them. And we've have pictures and videos of combats between them in the other side of the border, in the Venezuelan area. What you have is a country promoting this type of actions 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles from the Colombian border. So that makes it even more difficult. And unless we have a solution in Venezuela, a real solution, a change of regime that returns to democracy and returns to normalcy, this is going to be very, very difficult to manage. And it's a very big challenge, not only for Colombia, but for the whole region. As a matter of fact, the ELN right now, the terrorist organization from Colombia, is now being talked upon as the Hezbollah of South America. They want a rogue regime, like the Venezuelan regime wants to use the ELN to create havoc in a country like Colombia and maybe in other countries. So it's becoming a multilateral threat, not only for Colombia, but for the whole region.
So Venezuela is supporting these armed groups? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no doubt about it. There is no doubt that the dictatorship of Maduro is supporting them. Most of the leaders are on the other side. They're getting trained by the armed forces, especially in the use of missiles, of surface-to-air missiles. No, they've become an integral part of the survival strategy of the Maduro regime. They need to create chaos in Colombia. They need to create chaos in the region. They need to increase drugs. So that's part of an integral strategy that is being supported by the Cuban government, by the Russian government, and obviously by the rogue state of Venezuela.
Ambassador, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Next on the program, we continue to focus on children affected by the crisis in Venezuela itself. Short break, and we will be right back.
The Investigative Journal, TIJ, offers exclusive long-form investigations into the leading political, environmental, and public interest issues of the day. Our first-hand investigations focus on topics ranging from human rights, counterterrorism, corruption, cybercrime, just to name a few. These bombshell reports can only be found on the Investigative Journal from New York. I'm Tal Heinrich.
Welcome back. More than 4 million Venezuelans have fled their country because of lack of access to food, medicine, labor, or human rights violations. Children have been hit the hardest.
En la calle te pasan muchas cosas, te ven los policías, te pegan, te tratan mal, la gente te menosprecia porque estás en la calle. Hay personas que nos insultan, nos dicen, vayan a pedirle al presidente.
En mi casa había más o menos comida, no alcanzaba, nosotros éramos muchos.
To hear more about the plight of children in Venezuela and the latest on the political power struggle in the country, we are joined on set by a leader of the Venezuelan opposition, Mr. Brian Fincheltub, Chief of Staff to the Deputy Chief of Mission for Venezuela's internationally recognized government embassy in Washington, D.C. Brian, welcome. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is scheduled to present an oral update on the human rights situation in Venezuela in September. What's expected to be in this report?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting us, Tal. It's a pleasure to be with you. And yes, as you said, recently the High Commissioner of the UN, Michelle Bachelet, was in Venezuela, was in our country, and she showed a report about the humanitarian crisis that we are facing in Venezuela, but not only the humanitarian crisis, also the political crisis because of the regime we have, the tortures, the sexual abuses, the arbitrarily detained people. So what we expect from the UN is that to create an inquiry commission, not only to tell the world what's happening, also that we can have justice on what's happening in Venezuela. Not only that, that we can break with the cycle of impunity that we have today in our country. Today in our country, you kill someone and nothing happens. You have more probabilities to get in jail if you are a politician or if you think different than if you literally go and kill someone. So these kind of things are harming our country, and as a consequence, as you told earlier, we have already more than 4 million Venezuelans that have fled, escaping from the crisis in our country.
And many of them are children. Tell me, how dangerous is it to be a child in Venezuela right now?
So dangerous because, just to start with an example, last year the average of Venezuelans lost 24 pounds on the year. That's 11 kilograms. We have like 60% of our poor children that have malnutrition. So for example, if you have a kid that doesn't even have a plate of food a day, how can you expect of that kid to go to school, to do sports? So what's happening with a lot of our kids is that they are getting in criminal bands just because of food, or that they are getting recruited by ELN, by these terrorist groups that most of them are in Colombia, in the border, to take advantage of these kids, and not because the kids want, because they threaten them that if they don't go there, they won't give them food, they will kill their families. So we are having a big problem, because even though I'm 100% sure that this nightmare will be over, we are losing a lot of time as a country, because while other countries as Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru are thinking how many highways, how many colleges are they going to build, like Israel, for example, how are they going to fight against cancer? In Venezuela, our problem is a plate of food. In Venezuela, our problem is to get a pill, because you are sick. So that's what we are fighting against, and that's why we need the support of all the world to get over it.
Brian, if we look at other revolutions or dictatorships in history, a major part of their ability to sustain themselves has always been education, like Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, even the Iranian regime. When it comes to Venezuela, how has education in the country helped in sustaining the socialist regime?
Well, even though they have tried to ideologize our children in the public education, we have even a worse problem, that we have like 60% of absence in the classrooms, because what I just told you. But the other part is that we have a lot of Cubans that progressively around these years, they have gotten in all the institutions with one goal: to ideologize not only our children, to ideologize all our institutions, our policemen, our army, and they have done it threatening to harm them, and they progressively they are making their goal. Just to make a comparison about other dictatorships, for example, Pinochet in Chile. In 17 years of dictatorship, he disappeared or killed 3,000 people that resisted against the authority. In Venezuela, just between 2018 and 2019, more than 7,000 people have been killed because the reason is resist to the authority. So I just point this because it's important for our audience that they can compare, even though all the dictatorships are bad and all the regimes are bad, we are talking 3,000 in 17 years and 7,000 just in 2 years.
Brian, let's bring up a picture. I assume you remember this one. It's from 2012. It shows 12-year-old and 13-year-old children holding M16 rifles at a ceremony in the middle of Caracas. And President Hugo Chavez, he had to confront this scene after a lot of international outrage. It's forced his hand. And more recently, there was a report by the Miami Herald that broke a story of children being recruited by gangs in exchange for food, as you describe in Venezuela. What would you like to see other countries do in order to hold the Venezuelan regime accountable?
Well, that's why we need urgent an inquiry commission from the UN, not only, as I said before, to tell the world what's happening, to act. 21st century, like this cannot be happening. And I think international institutions like the UN, like the OAS, and many more exist to prevent these kind of things. What more has to happen in Venezuela in order that that something happens? What you tell about the kids, it's been happening more often since 2015, because as the regime loses power, the only way that they can maintain in power is by the force. So they are not only arming little kids and giving them food, they are also giving territory. For example, the state of Bolívar, the state of Amazonas, that are very rich states in minerals, in gold, to the guerrillas, because that's the only way they have to maintain control of the territory. So it's like an alliance, And this is a very dangerous threat not to Venezuela only, to the region. Because imagine if you are giving so much support, so much money, so much territory to terrorist groups, what will happen in 5 years with Colombia, for example, or what can happen with an alliance like Venezuela has with Iran, with Hezbollah, with all these terrorist groups. You know,
Those are good points.
It's a threat to the world. So that's why we need the world to act.
Brian, speaking of action, President Maduro recently confirmed that secret talks, I mean, not so secret anymore, has been taking place between the Trump administration and some of his top aides. What do you think about this strategy of the White House of negotiation and dialogue? We all know that the White House wants to push Maduro out of power, but what do you think about this way?
Our biggest ally in this fight has been the United States, and we are so thankful to the Trump administration and also to the bipartisan support we've had against this fight. But what I can say about that is that we trust 100% all the efforts that we are doing in this. And all that it's been done in Venezuela, it has been done as a team, not individually. So if they have conversations or whatever, it's just with one goal. How does this regime, how this nightmare ends? We want a peaceful transition. That's what everyone wants. What our desire is to do free elections. That's what we are fighting for. So if a way to do it, it's with having some talks, okay, perfect. Unfortunately, as the recent years has shown, we have tried to talk so much times. And what have happened, they make fun, not of us, they make fun of our population, that while every day passes, more and more people are suffering and are dying because of lacks of medicines and lacks of food. And not only that, for example, today we are 4 million of refugees that have to escape from our country. We are the second country in the world that has more refugees after Syria. The difference with Syria is that they had a war. We didn't have a war. And the threat for the world is that if things keep going like they are, next year, statistics say that we will be 8 million refugees.
Wow, that's a lot.
So, to clarify, if talking or if putting a lot of pressure will make these sick people go out, perfect, let's do it. But the point is that there is not only being secret conversation, as President Trump said, all options are on the table, and that's what we are doing, pushing in all options to get out of these people.
Brian Fincheltub from Venezuela's international recognized government embassy in Washington, D.C. We thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tal.
Coming up next, we'll hear from the world's foremost expert on the protection of children in war and mitigating the involvement of youth in violent conflicts.
The Investigative Journal, TIJ, offers exclusive long-form investigations into the leading political, environmental, and public interest issues of the day. Our first-hand investigations focus on topics ranging from human rights, counterterrorism, corruption, cybercrime, just to name a few. These bombshell reports can only be found on the Investigative Journal from New York. I'm Tal Heinrich.
Welcome back. We continue to focus on children affected by the crisis in Venezuela. According to a new report from the Venezuela Observatory for Violence, 1,484 children were killed in Venezuela in the year 2018. The Venezuelan police has reportedly brought to the death of 287 children under the age of 18. The report goes on to say, quote, there are individuals against whom the officials of the Maduro regime carry out a lethal extrajudicial execution and clearly outside the law. Fatal victims have been shot in their bed, defenseless, being at home without being armed or at risk to the officials who murdered them. To discuss, we're joined by Dr. Shelly Whitman, the Executive Director of the Roméo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative at Dalhousie University in Canada, the world's foremost expert on the protection of children in war and mitigating the involvement of youth in violent conflicts. Dr. Whitman, great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
First, tell us, what are you seeing and hearing is going on with children in Venezuela now?
Well, over the last couple of years, we've been hearing about a lot of mistreatment, much as you had described generally of the population. But what we've started to notice is that increasingly children and youth who have been more vulnerable to conflict because of the challenges that their parents face, lack of food, lack of access to medicines, and the challenges that it creates for them to just be able to have basic access to the necessities of life has meant that families have been put under special duress. But increasingly, what we also see is that there are special forces who have been created by Maduro, who have not only done violence against the local populations, but have also increasingly been engaging young people in the conflict, either through direct recruitment of the children or through involving them through political youth movements, and then getting them engaged more and more into the efforts to create fear and violence.
Having studied other crises, what's next for these children that you describe? How can the opposition or other countries or international institutions even reduce the threat to their youth?
Yeah, it's a great question, because what we see is that there are these patterns of vulnerability of children and violence that exists. And the harder it gets to have adults to believe in your cause and to be a part of it, the more likely that a particular force or a regime will turn to indoctrinating youth because they're generally easier to have involved because of their lack of understanding of long-term consequences, also because of risk-taking that is normal for young people to undertake because of their brain development. And what we see is that when this starts to happen, the real fear that we have is that what may have appeared to be more sporadic then becomes systematic, and we have great fear that this can lead to all-out armed conflict, as well as to mass atrocities being committed on the territory. And then you have generations of young people who are educated in violence. And what does that mean for the future of a country? I would make reference to countries like Syria as an example of how this kind of attempts had begun early on in the conflict. And now when you look at the situation in Syria, what you see is an absolute decimation of the education system, real challenges in terms of rebuilding the country, and how you're ever going to end the conflict when you've had hundreds and thousands of people who have left the country, who are educated and capable, but no longer have a home to return to.
What could be the most effective way to somehow help children in conflicts without first solving the conflict itself, politically or militarily? Is it even possible?
No, it isn't impossible, and I'm really glad you asked that question, because what we have tried to focus on at the Dallaire Initiative, and what we see some movements on with the United Nations as well, is trying to understand that actually what we need to do is to put measures in place, as well as some demands from external governments on the governments that we may be dealing with, or with the armed groups we may be dealing with, to make children be what we call children's rights up front, to have them be the first line of protection. And if we could do that, if we could make children to be the priority for protection, to at least get parties to a conflict to agree that even if we're going to be in a conflict situation, we're going to all agree that we're not going to use children, we would go a long way to finding mechanisms where we could protect children, but also prevent the long duration of the conflicts as well. And those kinds of priorities are things that even the most hardened individuals will generally find a capability to try to come together and talk about.
The priorities that you mentioned are part of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Venezuela is one of the signatories of this convention. And under Article number 38 of the convention, signatories are required to ensure respect for rules of international humanitarian law as it relates to children affected by armed conflicts. Is Venezuela in violation of this article?
Yes, I would say that it is in violation of that article, and it's in violation of several other international documents with respect to human rights, but definitely with respect to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In addition to that, just generally, if we look at other conventions such as the Safe Schools Declaration, or we look at the optional protocol to the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which prohibits the involvement of young people in conflict, there are several that we could point to where it is in violation of those priorities, and it should be a priority for the world to get them back on track.
Dr. Shelly Whitman, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your time. We should mention here that the Investigative Journal has searched for the Venezuelan government's response in their internationally mandated reports to the United Nations. Here's the statement, quote, "The state of Venezuela has established mechanisms to prevent and eradicate any form of exploitation, abuse, and violence, especially against the most vulnerable population groups. It has set up specialized advocacy services on disability, special prosecutors' offices catering for women and children, and child protection councils." And that does it for this episode of the Investigative Journal. I'm Tal Heinrich. Until next time, from Times Square in New York, thank you for watching.